Here, it's time to hear from Alwyn G8DOH about the best kind of radios for contesting and DXing on the VHF and UHF bands. And don't forget, if you want to ask Alwyn a question, you need to use that chat facility on the actual YouTube stream. And don't forget to include your call sign. We'll do our best to fit you in before the end of the session at 2 to 3. So, Alwyn, hello. We're not talking Chinese, cheap Chinese handhelds here, are we?
Well, it's amazing how cheap some things are that are really, really good. So very good afternoon. Greetings from somewhat overcast central London today. And I'm going to talk about VHF, UHF radios with an emphasis on good performance for contesting and DXing. So this is the outline of the talk. I'll first scope it, talk a little bit about the RF environment. And this really matters because we need to fit the radio to the RF environment it's going to work in. Then in turn, receiver performance, transmitter performance, and finally conclusion. There will be some what I'll describe as league tables of transceivers, which you'll, of course, when the talk is available later, you can browse in more detail at your leisure. So the scope. I want to talk about the key issues for transmitter and receiver performance at VHF, UHF. They're not the same as for work at HF. And the main reason that they're not the same is because at HF, the background noise levels are a lot higher. Although I should say that, of course, many of us suffer from RF noise of one sort or another, even at VHF, UHF, and I will say a little bit about taking that into account. The talk is for terrestrial operations. If you're doing EME, so hopefully you're not looking at anything on this planet, the key thing is to have the noise figure that you require very low. I'm also not going to say anything about operating features. The reviews cover this very well, and we all have operating features that we like or don't like. So I won't be covering that. And finally, a disclaimer. I don't have any financial interest or involvement in any manufacturer or dealer in amateur radio equipment. This is my personal view of the situation. So first, the radio frequency environment. If we look towards the horizon, these are the minimum noise levels that we will be able to receive. And what you'll note from this table, if I get the magic laser pointer to illustrate the point, the noise level at 6 meters is a good 10 dBs more than the noise level at 70 centimeters. Therefore, having a really, really low noise figure receiver for 6 meters is not as important as having a low noise figure receiver for 70 centimeters, or even more so, 23 centimeters and above. If you make the noise figure very, very low on 6 meters, the main thing you will do is make it easier for the receiver to be overloaded by strong signals. So we need to take into account these actual levels of noise. The qualification, of course, is that in urban areas, the noise floors are much higher. These are the minimums. And I can tell you in my bit of central London, the noise level on 2 meters is over 30 dB above this level. So you can't really operate in any serious way on 2 meters. At 2 meters. The next thing is receiving other stations, and in particular those stations that are quite close to you. So the strongest signals that we can receive are those which are simply line of sight, so free space path loss. And the free space path loss depends a little bit on frequency, and as we'll see, depends on antennas too. But basically, as we go up in frequency, the free space path loss gets larger. And on practical paths, because there's some ground scattering, the loss typically is about 10 to 30 dBs larger than this minimum. Now, the reason that this is important is to see how strong a signal will we get from another local station, so that we can dimension what kind of receiver performance in terms of dynamic range we need. So the other factors in the equation for received power are how much power the other station's transmitting with, how much gain the transmitting antenna has, the path loss, of course, as we've discussed, and how much gain we have for our receive antenna. So what tends to happen is that at the higher frequency bands, for a given physical size, we can get more gain in the antennas, and that makes up for the increase in path loss. So taking those into account, you can estimate what will happen if there's a legal limit station 10 kilometers away. How much power will be received? I've allowed for not huge antennas, but the sort of thing that contest stations use. And this is quite interesting because what it shows is that the most difficult bands to struggle with are 2 meters and 70 centimeters. Signal's slightly less strong because the antenna gain is somewhat smaller at the lower frequencies, and because of path loss relative to the antenna sizes that are practical, slightly weaker at 23 cents. So these tend to be the bands where we see the worst challenges. And there's some data taken from the 2 meter trophy, I think it was in 2015. And here's the spectrum we were receiving at G3M. And here is the strongest signal that we were receiving during that contest. A signal strength of minus 44 decibels relative to a milliwatt in 444 hertz bandwidth. So that fits the calculation pretty well, because the calculated value for that station would be minus 35 dBm. It's about 9 dB less strong, and therefore that's the ground scatter effect between the stations. You could be very unlucky and be propagating across water that was very smooth and actually manage to enhance your free space signal, but it doesn't happen that often. There's wind and waves to be considered. So the strong signals are really strong, of order minus 30 to minus 40 dBm. And if our receiver can't handle those, we will be in trouble. So now on to the receiver performance. There are two challenges. The first one that doesn't get enough attention is that there's lots of other RF in the world, lots of out-of-band signals. And as I'll show, a lot of those signals are really strong. So the first thing we need to do is to filter out out-of-band signals. We're not interested in them, so we should get rid of them. Our second problem is strong in-band signals. We're interested in these signals, so we can't just filter them out. All we can do is make the very best receiving system that we can. And very best in this context means the receiving system with the biggest possible spurious-free dynamic range. As I'll show in practice, if you're using equipment that you can buy as opposed to building your own specialist receiver, the easiest solution is a good transverter with a high performance HF transceiver at the moment. I will also look at transceivers in a box, but the performance tends to be less good. So out-of-band signals first. This is what I measure in rural Oxfordshire on 2 times 18 element for 70 centimeters. So 70 centimeter antennas but I'm looking across the frequency range from a few tens of megahertz up to a gigahertz. What you see is that although it's way out of the band of the antennas, the local FM broadcast signals are really strong, minus 40 dBm. Tetra, public safety, is very strong as well. Digital audio broadcasting, not quite so strong, but still significant. There happens to be a scanner, a telemetry scanner, just down the road from my site. And that's stronger still. That's about minus 36 dBm, and it's almost in band, so the antennas work quite nicely for it. Then all of digital television, and then cellular above there, and of course that extends even higher. So these signal levels are really high, and if you shove them straight into a high gain preamplifier, you may manage to overload the preamplifier before you do anything else and wreck your receiver performance. So you need a good filter. This is one of the preamplifiers for 70 centimeter that you can buy. And the nice thing about this preamp is that the outer band signals have been thought about. So it has very nice filtering and just knocks the outer band signals down by 30 dB to 40 dB. And that really makes it easier to build the system. So when you're looking for preamps, look for ones that have thought about out of band signals. Don't just look for the one that has the lowest possible noise figure. So I said that the key metric for performance is the spurious-free dynamic range for the receiver. And what spurious-free dynamic range is the difference between the noise level, no signals present, to the signal level, the input signal level, at which distortion products just begin to come out of the noise, just come out of the noise. So we want to make this as big as we possibly can. The picture I'm showing here is a classical picture for what's called weak nonlinearity. And in weakly nonlinear systems, the in-band products that cause us the most problems are the third order intermodulation products. They're of the form, if you have two signals, F1 and F2, they are 2F1 minus F2 or 2F2 minus F1. So they are just the spacing between the two signals away from those signals. So they're close to the frequencies we're trying to work at. That's why they're a problem. As we'll see later, for systems that are not weakly nonlinear, the other intermodulation terms can actually be as significant or more significant than these. So although this picture is valid, whatever the order of intermodulation, we still need the maximum spurious-free dynamic range. But on systems that are not weakly nonlinear, it may be that the first intermodulation terms to cause us interference may come from a different mixing process. They may be fifth, seventh, or higher order. But whatever pops out of the noise first sets the limit for the spurious-free dynamic range. So basically, we can define the receiver performance with just two parameters. One, the internally generated noise level, which should be such that we can hear the weakest signals that are on the band, and two, the spurious-free dynamic range. So it's actually really a rather simple specification. Now, there are other receiver problems that we need to worry about, and one of them is what's called reciprocal mixing. This is where the local oscillator or clock in the receiver is noisy, has jitter and modulation on it, and then a strong received signal can convert, acts as the local oscillator to convert noise around the local oscillator down to IF and mask our wanted signal. That's called reciprocal mixing. We can also suffer trying to receive a particular signal from another station that has a noisy signal, that has radiated noise. That radiated noise can mask our wanted signal, as here, and I'll show an example of that a little bit later in the talk. So now let's talk a little bit about architectures. This is a hybrid radio architecture. So well-known example is the Elecraft K3. There are plenty of others. We take in a signal, bandpass filter it. Note this is quite a broad filter. Preamplify it, mix it down to an intermediate frequency and place it through a sharp filter. So for sideband, 3 kilohertz wide filter. We then feed it into an analog to digital converter, perform all the DSP filtering functions on it, recover the audio, and that's the audio output. So that is a hybrid radio architecture. Now notice that the number of signals that reach the analog to digital converter is determined by this filter. And the strong signal performance of this type of architecture is determined by the weak nonlinearity of the mixer and of the filter, and possibly, if it's a really badly designed preamp, by the preamplifier also. But these are the critical components, and they are the things that you have to spend money on to get a high performance system. Obviously, the local oscillator must be spectrally pure, as I discussed in the last slide. So for that architecture, as you gradually increase the strength of signals, you can see here the third order intermodulation products, which are will limit the dynamic range of the system, just beginning to pop out of the noise. If we put stronger signals into the receiver, we now see strong intermodulation products, which if we were trying to receive a signal on those frequencies, that would be a big problem. And you see also some much weaker higher order products, like the 5th order products here and here, 7th order product here, and just about possible to spot it there. And then if you wind the input power up even higher, that's minus 25 dBm per tone in this experiment. You can see the 3rd order product, the 5th order product, the 7th order product, the 9th order product. But notice that the 3rd order is the strongest, the others are weaker, which is why people used to talk so much about the 3rd order intercept point. As you'll see in this talk, I don't talk about that metric, and the reason is because we need to address issues with software-defined radios also. So here's a software-defined radio architecture. This is the Icom IC9700. Again, we have a bandpass filter, preamp, but the preamp goes straight into an analog to digital converter, then DSP and audio and loudspeaker. So there is no front-end mixer. There is simply an analog to digital converter. That means you don't need the high performance mixer and you don't need the narrow bandwidth filters, crystal filters. You do all your filtering in DSP. That saves you money, which is good. And also it allows you to implement easily nice display functions like pan adapters and other things that are very attractive. However, the analog to digital converter has to cope with a whole band full of signals without distortion. That puts a big challenge for the analog to digital converter. And so you need to spend your money on that component. The problem for analog to digital converters is that they may not be quite accurate. There's quantizing error for small signals. There's clipping, strong signal nonlinearity for large signals. And there may just be inaccuracy in the transfer function of the analog to digital converter. Any inaccuracy leads to distortion and spurious products. The dynamic range is 6 times the number of bits. You can use oversampling to increase the dynamic range, but achieving accuracy at higher sample rates is even more difficult. If you have multiple equal strength signals going into the analog to digital converter, their peaks sum as voltage, and so the overload power reduces as 20 log to the base 10 of the number of such strong signals. You can imagine the effect of that in a UK activity contest, and indeed I'll play you an audio clip to illustrate it. So here's an illustration of the nonlinear behavior of an ADC, and you see actually you've got 3rd order products, 5th order products, 7th order products visible there. They're all much the same signal strength. There's a whole host of them, and as these main signal levels vary, these things pop up and down in size, and I'll show a plot of that. So accuracy is key. So what I've measured here is the intermodulation characteristics. That's the ratio of intermodulation products, 3rd order intermodulation products over noise, for a transverter and a K3 as opposed to an IC9700. I have an IC9700. It's a very useful remote controlled radio, which is why I was able to make these measurements. So here are the intermodulation product levels for the transverter and K3, and you see strong signals, it starts to produce quite bad intermodulation products. As I reduce the strength of those signals, the intermodulation products get weaker and weaker until at about minus 47 dBm in this case, they drop below the noise level. So the IP to noise in 500 Hertz becomes 0. And if you reduce the input power further, that's where it stays. It never comes above the noise. So the spurious-free dynamic range is from the noise floor of the system up to this point. And in fact, it's a ratio of about 99 dB on my system. So in the IC9700, as I reduce the strength of the input signals, and this is, I'm just looking at the 3rd order products, I don't look at what happens to the higher order ones, but they're present also. The intermodulation gets weaker and weaker, and there's not a huge amount of difference here, so it looks good. But as the signal gets weaker, the intermodulation products come up again. And then you make it weaker, they go down again. They're bubbling along close to the noise floor, then they come up again. And they don't finally disappear until you're at minus 80 dBm per tone. So on a real band, the question is, what's the dynamic range? Well, with my strict definition of spurious-free dynamic range, the range is from the noise floor up to the first time one of these products gets above the noise floor. That's here. And it's 63 dB in 500 Hertz for an IC9700, for my IC9700. Other reviews measure things a little bit differently, and I've listed some of the different reviews. In the ARRL review, they take this as the point where the upper end of the dynamic range is. So that gives a much larger dynamic range. Another review sets it just below the start of this peak, gives a somewhat smaller dynamic range. Sherwood is more conservative and takes this raising above the noise floor, gives a smaller dynamic range still, and I'm miserable. I use the strict definition of SFDR, so I give you the lowest dynamic range. What difference does it make in practice? Well, what I've done is I recorded simultaneously the last week's UCAC on 2 meters with the ME2-HT stroke K3 and with the IC9700. So the 2 clips I'm going to play you is first with this one, you'll hear adjacent channel interference and you'll hear G0BNC, a relatively weak signal for me where I was beaming. And that's all you'll hear. I hope I've started the clip now. Not terribly strong. I don't hear it well. Maybe you'll have to listen to it later. But very different thing happens. Right. Thank you. Thank you for technical advice. Right. It's very good that we have. So let's just. Brilliant. Right, now we get things to work. Okay, so this is the one. This is the one with from the ME2-HT K3. I'll let it play to the end. Here's the one, exactly the same input signal strength, exactly the same frequency, but on the IC9700. You hear all that crackle. And that's the difference. It's considerably more difficult, and with a lot of strong signals, that's what you hear. That's a limited dynamic range. Nasty noise. Okay, let's move on. So what I do here is the received performance of VHF, UHF transceivers, and the table has two columns. I mean, I give the noise figure, measured noise figure of this variety of radios, and I give the spurious-free dynamic range in a 0.5 kilohertz bandwidth at 20 kilohertz offset from the strong signal. And what you can see is that it's a league table with a strict measurement of SFDR. The IC9700 does not do too well, but neither do a lot of other radios. And the thing that's of more interest is the column on the right, where I've actually included a preamplifier which doesn't overload, but ensures that we get a 3 dB overall noise figure so that we can hear weak signals. The effect, of course, is to reduce the dynamic range still further, and that gives this, this league table on the right. An alternative is to use a transverter and an HF transceiver, as I've just described with the ME2-HT K3. And here are some of the numbers that you get. You can get into the high 90s with the better transceivers. And note, somebody said to me a while back that I'm simply prejudiced against SDRs. I assure you I'm not. They just have to be really well implemented, and that tends to cost money. So you can get a pretty good result with a good transverter and something like a one of the better flex SDRs. It's not a cheap system, but you can get good numbers. So that's the league table. And so the typical system is to incorporate an HF transceiver, a transverter, and then on the receive side, a bandpass filter to get rid of out-of-band signals, a preamp to define the noise figure, and this vital component, an attenuator. And the idea of this attenuator is to just give sensitivity so that when you connect to the aerial, the receiver just very slightly degrades the noise you get in from the aerial. because that gives you the biggest dynamic range you can possibly get. There is no point in having no attenuator, a huge gain preamp with a very low noise figure, which gives big signals into the transverter. Yes, you'll hear very weak signals if there are no strong signals, but the strong signals amplified by the preamplifier will overload the rest of the system and limit your dynamic range. On transmit, if you go out on transmit, an attenuator to set the level to the PA so that you don't get excessive distortion, and again a filter to make sure that you're not producing any nasty out-of-band signals to trouble fellow spectrum users. So that's a simple system to construct. So let's say a little bit about transmitter performance to conclude. There is now an RSGB contest code of practice which sets recommended limits for spurious signals from transmitters. It covers both intermodulation products and noise, and it divides stations into what I call small stations, so a single antenna, 100 watts output power or less, which has a slightly more relaxed specification than a large station, which has multiple antennas and more than 100 watts output. We have to make the limit for spurious emissions stricter, because otherwise a badly designed one of these can cause havoc to many other band users. These numbers are given in a measurement bandwidth of 3 kilohertz. You can read the code of practice on the RSGB contest website. Intermodulation distortion is probably the easiest thing to solve. You need a well-designed PA, and you need not to drive it heavily. If you're lucky enough to have a spectrum analyzer, then examine the levels of the intermodulation products and make sure they are well within code of practice limits. If you don't have a spectrum analyzer, then I recommend that you drive most amplifiers to not more than a half of their rated output power on speech peaks. You need a PEP watt meter, so a bird watt meter with a bird through line with a PEP attachment, which you can buy off eBay for £30 or so. Having a large PA and no method of measuring the peak envelope power coming out of it not only is a bit of a likely to make you in breach of your license conditions, but also is likely to lead to you having a nasty signal on the band. So the easiest way to a clean signal from the intermodulation point of view is a big PA, well underdriven. Probably the single biggest problem on the bands though now is radiated noise. This is broadband amplitude and phase noise from transmitters, which just lifts the noise floor for local stations. So we are actually polluting our own bands. This is a problem that has become greater and greater in recent years as radios use lower voltage rails and sometimes software defined radios where there's inadequate filtering, because there are a lot of digital signals in a software defined radio and we have to be very careful to keep them out of the signal path. So the code of practice requires the most difficult number to meet is at 50 kilohertz or greater offset from carrier, the noise needs to be less than minus 125 dBs relative to carrier in a 1 hertz bandwidth for a small station, and less than minus 135 dBc per hertz for a large station. There's a relaxation to these standards at the microwave frequencies to allow for frequency multiplication of phase noise. What does radiated noise do in numbers across the bands? Well, on 6 meters, the band noise is quite high. So actually, the penalty from this specification for a receiving station 10 kilometers away if we meet the code of practice, there isn't actually a penalty on 6 meters. Even for a station meeting this standard, on 4 meters, the noise would rise by about 1 S point from a station that met the standard. On 2 meters, the nearby station 10 kilometers away would see an increase in noise floor of 2 S points. And this is for equipment that meets the standard. So people who've said this standard is too stringent, I would beg to disagree based upon these calculations. Of course, if you have no nearby stations, you don't have to worry so much. But in our crowded island, there are very few stations who have no other stations within 200 kilometers of them. So here's an illustration. This was the, I think, 2 meter trophy in 2016. Here's part of the band, plus minus 100 kilohertz, and there is a station with bad radiated noise. So the station's not transmitting at the moment. The noise floor in 444 hertz bandwidth was about minus 140 dBm. On comes the station with high radiated noise. The noise floor has just shot up by 10 dB, blanking out any weak signals within, not just local to him, as with intermodulation products, but right across the band. And it sounds like this. You'll hear the noise coming and going. That's the radiated noise. He stops calling CQ. Quieter again. And there he's back again with his auto CQer on, playing havoc with everybody else who's trying to work weak stations. So radiated noise is a real menace and we need to pay attention to it. I'll just let the clip complete. So some measurements. These are measurements on a variety of VHF transceivers. I've plotted, these are the code of practice limits at 50 kilohertz offset here. And this is an ancient IC202, a very early SSB transceiver for 2 meters. This transceiver, the curve here, the green curve is phase noise, the black curve is amplitude noise, and the blue curve is composite noise. That's the total noise power. This ancient transceiver can meet both the small signal, the small station and the large station limits for radiated noise. No problem at all. Let's move on to a modern radio, the IC9700. This radio, set to 85% of full power, just meets the small station limit on 2 meters. But if we turn the power down, the amplitude noise comes up and it now breaches the small signal limit, small station limit for radiated noise. I'm just talking here of the small station limit. This radio cannot meet the large station limit at all, so it should not be used with the power amplifier ever. On 70 centimeters, the noise is above the small station limit, so it breaks the code of practice limit by 10 dBs on 70 centimeters. On 23 centimeters, it breaks the code of practice limit by 17 dBs. If we use an HF transceiver with an HF transceiver with a transverter, we can make use of low phase noise transceivers. So this is measurements on a K3S, and it meets both small and large signal limits comfortably. So here finally are some league tables. Of the transceivers in a box, only the IC202 has a green traffic light because it could be used for small or large stations. The IC9100 and 9700 on 2 meters can meet small signal. The rest can't meet the code of practice, either for small or large signals. For HF transceivers, by contrast, quite a number can meet the large station limit. And you have to go back to quite old radios like the FT-DX 5000 will still meet the small station limit. And only a few, but incidentally, note that the KX3, which is a good receiver, is not a good clean transmitter for VHF transverter use, and therefore can't meet the code of practice. So finally, what to look for? You need a receiver with a noise figure that's low enough that it will enable the weakest terrestrial signals to be heard. Generally around 2 dB or so will work in the VHF bands. Don't make the noise figure ultra low because you will compromise strong signal handling. You need to get the maximum spurious-free dynamic range that you can with this low noise figure. 100 dB and 3 kilohertz bandwidth would be very nice to do and is quite tough to do. On transmitters, you need low intermodulation products, should be looking for -70 dBc at 20 kilohertz offset from carrier. And above all, at the moment, we need low radiated noise, better than -135 dBc per hertz at 50 kilohertz offset, especially if you're a large station. This is doable, but it's not really doable with transceivers in a box. It generally requires a good HF transceiver and a transverter. So in conclusion, we need high dynamic range receivers and low radiated noise transmitters. That way we can all hear the DX and hopefully work it. There isn't a current commercial VHF UHF transceiver which can be used with a legal limit PA to make a large station if there are near neighbor stations. A transverter approach is needed. Some of the commercial VHF UHF transceivers have such high radiated noise that they shouldn't be used with a PA, and some are even higher and shouldn't be used at all where there are other stations in the neighborhood. So there is another advantage. If you have a low radiated noise transceiver, it may well have low phase noise, which will benefit your reciprocal mixing performance on receive. So you will get benefit for yourself on receive, as well as being a good neighbor. And in summary, it remains the fact that a good HF transceiver with a transverter and an underrun PA with its level carefully set is the easiest way of having a high performing VHF UHF station. So here are some things to read. The QST and Radcom equipment reviews are worth reading the technical sections of, as well as all the operational features. Sherwood Engineering, Rob Sherwood, publishes a great table of transceiver performance, which I highly recommend. I wrote up quite a number of these factors in a Radcom article back in 2015, so that might be worth a reread. But generally look carefully at the specifications, not just the operational features. And finally, I'd like to thank ARRL, Bob Allison in particular, for permission to use some of their measured data in calculations for the purposes of the information I've presented. And I'd like to thank the convention team who've been enormously technically helpful in getting this talk out. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alwyn. Some few things to think about there. In fact, somebody on the chat is saying, have you presented these findings to the radio manufacturers, and did you get any feedback?
I don't have any, as I said, I'm entirely independent of radio manufacturers. I have certainly had correspondence with some of the better transceiver manufacturers, and quite interesting dialogues. And I've certainly found that people who think about making these products commercially, one of the things is there's a lot of work done on HF transceivers, and the requirements for HF are really a bit different from those for VHF, UHF. So you know, the understanding is developing, but no, I'm not planning to, you know, to lobby the manufacturers of transceivers. I think I've got a lot of sympathy for them, because when all's said and done, they've got to make a product that people are prepared to buy. And, you know, it's no use them providing a really high performing product that nobody can afford to buy. So what I think the best thing is for us all to be intelligent customers. We can actually still find some very high performing transceivers on the second-hand market. And perhaps if we focus on that rather than buying the latest, you know, the latest commercial offering, it may send a message that we need slightly better RF performance in the new transceivers that are coming onto the market. But let's not forget, it's going to be a big challenge for any manufacturer to build this very high performance at a low price. It's no easy technical problem. So I do think manufacturers respond to general customer feedback, and if we're intelligent customers, we'll probably get better products.
Well, Eric Swartz said this morning he definitely responds to customers' feedback. Tim Haig, a M0AFJ, said your findings on the 9700 mirror what he's found on a Cornish hilltop, and says it must be a lot worse in IO92. And he also suggests that perhaps reviewers of this equipment should stop pulling their punches. What do you think?
Well, again, I don't want to criticize. I don't want to criticize the reviewers. I mean, reviewing is very hard work, you know, making these sort of measurements. And one thing I think I should say about the measurements I made on the IC9700, trying to measure intermodulation products that are just above the noise floor, it's tricky. I mean, you've got to be very patient. You've got to sit there and you've got to make the measurements very carefully. And, you know, if I had to, you know, go through all the routine measurements that reviewers make on radios, I mean, it would take a very long time to extract all this data. So, you know, I think the reviewers do a very good job, and they don't want to write a review that is so technical that nobody's going to appreciate the finer points of it. But I do think that we should be honest about the spurious-free dynamic range of transceivers. And I think as in particular for the SDRs, it was quickly realized that just quoting the third order intermodulation product didn't give a true picture of the performance of the transceiver. But what's for sure is that the spurious-free dynamic range does. And I think it would be great if the reviews could measure that, could at least measure that parameter as carefully as possible, assuming that the resources are available to make the measurement. It's not easy to make that measurement. As for radiated noise, that's, well, there are various ways of making the measurement, but I think this is, if there was one thing I would improve in the current crop of VHF, UHF transceivers, it would be radiated noise, because in the UCACs, sitting in the middle of IO92, I really, you know, my noise level goes up by 15 to 20 dB, so I'm never going to work any weak stations, and I think that's a real shame.
One or two people, Chris Budd and Colin Leonard, G4ERO, saying they're glad they hung on to their IC202s. Nice. Oh, I don't know if you're able to do this, but Dave Goodwin, VE9CB, wonders if you can play, you know, the first set of audio that you did the comparison on. It didn't come across too well. I wonder if you could, if there's any chance that you could.
I'm going to try. I was very grateful to Dom for helping me out. I didn't realise that the laser pointer didn't work as a laser as a cue control. So I'm just going to go back and I'll try and play that comparison again. I'm sorry that the first clip is slightly lower in audio level than the second one. So I'm hoping that we can get it a little bit better this time for you with the wonderful assistance of our team. So this one really, if it could just be eased up a little in level, it would help. It's not regulated to best BBC standards. I do apologise. So here's the ME. Here's the ME2-HT K3. Did you hear that?
Yes, I heard that. Okay.
Okay. Right, now here is the IC9700. Now what I want to emphasize is that in this test I used a hybrid splitter, so the signal strength going into the two systems is absolutely identical. So there's that nasty crackle.
Okay, thanks for doing that. It was it broke up for me, but that could be just my link. How are we doing for time? I can't tell, my clock's gone off. Ian, GW7APP, says he bought the FT991 with the idea of taking part in a small way with the VHF UHF contest. Does it mean he has to sell it or not use it for what he wanted to?
Well, I think the answer for the FT991, which has very, very large level of radiated noise, is obviously it's got, you know, a whole huge range of bands in a single box, and it's compact. It's a lovely thing to take out on the hills. Now, I think the answer is, I noticed he has a GW7 call sign. So if he's lucky, he may live in one of these parts of the country where he doesn't have any near neighbours. So if he can be far enough away from his neighbours, he won't cause them any problem. But far enough away for an FT991 is probably 100 kilometres plus.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Alwyn. Thank you very much. I think there's plenty to think about there. Thank you very much for the questions too.
Indeed. Thank you.